Go ahead and go my. So welcome everyone. Welcome Zach. He's a third year MFA in fiction writing in the School of Humanities. And what we're going to hear about today is really focused on the intersection with addiction and spirituality. The major project he's working on is a novel that explores these same themes, and in particular ask like how does forgiveness function and how do our resentment and condemnations both of ourselves and others keep us sick and repeating the same mistakes. So, welcome, Zach. I really appreciate your time. And my name is Kelly Sharp. I am the Director of Medical Humanities and really just appreciate everyone being here. So, the format's going to be around like 35 to 40 minutes of Zach presentation, and then we'll have lots of time for questions. So, thank you. Take it over, Zach.
All right. Hello everybody. Okay, so I'm just gonna get started. I have a little PowerPoint presentation that I'm gonna jump in and out of, so you're not just hearing this disembodied voice. So you'll see a little bit of my face and a little bit of PowerPoint. So I guess to begin with, I have to admit, like I feel a little bit out of place. I'm an MFA presenting the work that's going into a novel, rather than the more formal research that a PhD might be presenting. So I wasn't like exactly sure how best to present this like weird, disorganized, and sometimes mystical process that goes into the work I've been doing the past 3 years. And the truth is, the work I've been doing the past 3 years extends quite a bit beyond that. Really to the past 5 years, because it was about 5 years ago in my life that I started to get sober. That addiction and recovery is a central concern of this novel, is the reason the Center for Medical Humanities saw fit to grant me their support. So rather than present to you what I'm sure would just be like a jumble of disconnected and amateur research, instead I'd like to tell the story of how this novel came about and why its concerns are personally relevant to me. This is not the first time I have talked about my life in this manner. I have told this story, or at least parts of this story, in one form or another at rehabs and hospitals and institutions. And as it is about addiction, spiritual matters are inevitably going to come up. I've found that in academia, there can be resistance to how much recovery work is intensely introspective and intensely spiritual. But I'd ask you to keep an open mind going forward with this story and how I'm presenting it. On the coins of Alcoholics Anonymous is Polonius's advice to Laertes in Hamlet: "To thine own self be true." And I don't really know of a more true way to tell this story you're about to hear. I'd like to begin with a story my mother told me when I was 6 years old. And I'd like to start here because this is really the spiritual foundation of this novel I'm working on. So my mother went to school in Flagstaff, Arizona. And she told me a story when I was 6 about a man she knew back then named Evan. And when she told me this story, she told me it was a true story. That's something I believed then, and I still believe it to be, and in my head, it is a true story. When this man named Evan was young, he was working on a construction site, motioning a bulldozer to stop, when the man driving the vehicle accidentally pressed the accelerator and pinned Evan against a tree. The metal of the bulldozer split Evan open at the center of his body. When my mother told this story to a 6-year-old me, she explained that when she heard this story from Evan's own mouth, he lifted his shirt to show her the scar around his stomach. Pinned against the tree, Evan passed out, believing he was dead, certainly. But right before he passed out, a short line of poetry came into his mind. "Nothing in the voice of a cicada intimates its own death." Well, Evan woke up in the hospital. His organs had been neatly stuffed back into him. I'm going to jump back to my face here. And nothing miraculous had happened short of that the doctors had saved him. He made a full recovery, but in all his time in the hospital, he never forgot that one line, that nothing in the voice of a cicada intimates its own death. So when he got out of the hospital, Evan went searching. He looked through all his books and eventually found the line written in a short story by J.D. Salinger called Teddy, and that led him to the Japanese poet who'd written it. But none of this was satisfying to Evan. He felt some itch to know that hadn't been scratched. And so he started researching cicadas. He learned that cicadas use their voice twice in their life, once when they mate and once right before they die, as a final swan song. And he realized that the way they make this sound is by shaking a special organ in their bodies, and that organ can only be accessed when they split their bodies open at the center. About 20 years after my mom told me this story, I had my first and only fentanyl overdose. I was about 27, and my father was in the room with me. He was the one who resuscitated me, and if he hadn't been there, I probably wouldn't be here today. Not long after that, I went to a rehab in Great Falls, Montana. It was called Rocky Mountain Treatment Center. And Rocky Mountain Treatment Center was not a comfortable place. It was in an abandoned nunnery. The beds were like right next to each other with this tiny partition down the center, like you were a 17th century married couple. And usually your roommate was going to be a 300-pound coal miner with stacks of chewing tobacco next to him. I went in with a big collection of books that my parents had given me, Han Chan's Cold Mountain Poems, the Bhagavad Gita, all sorts of stuff. They took them all from me, and they handed me a Bible. So as the son of a pagan English teacher and a practicing Zen Buddhist for my mother, I railed at the hypocrisy of, on the one hand, using Polonius's quote, to be true to thyself, and on the other hand, forcing these symbols of Christianity upon me. But the truth is my resentment was misplaced. Rocky Mountain Treatment Center was a great rehab. It wasn't comfortable and it wasn't flashy, but the people there cared. And eventually my counselor let me keep one of the books. I chose a book called Being Aware of Being Aware by a spiritual teacher named Rupert Spira. And that book was a fortunate choice. It would be the book that helped me build the spiritual foundation I needed to recover. One of the strongest memories I have from rehab is this day when a counselor instructed our group to look to our left and then look to our right, and explained that statistically, the people sitting on either side of us would relapse within a year of leaving treatment. They explained that the statistics for treatment were hopelessly abysmal. 2 to 3% of anyone who goes to rehab, they said, will stay sober for an extended period. And then they explained that while rehab's success rate was low, the single most successful program for recovery was Alcoholics Anonymous, which they claimed had a 30% success rate. I'm going to jump back to slides here. I've since checked those statistics, and while they are kind of the basic standard for statistics around rehab and recovery in Alcoholics Anonymous, the veracity is very, very questionable. The National Institute on Drug Abuse, as well as the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, put rehab success rates at 30 to 60%. Other sources claim that 30% of anyone who goes to rehab will relapse after the first month. The truth is that finding reliable information about this stuff is next to impossible, because what for-profit treatment centers deem as successful is a definition that they decide. And nearly all the information we have about Alcoholics Anonymous comes directly from the program itself. Some statistics suggest that if you count everyone who's ever gone into the doors of an AA meeting and then never returned, that the success rate for AA would be in the single digits. At the time, I didn't question the stats, though. I felt secure in believing, and I do still believe this today, that Alcoholics Anonymous and other similar 12-step programs are the most successful routes to long-term sobriety. I don't believe this because of statistics. I believe this because when you're in and around the world of addiction and recovery, the simple truth of the matter is that the people with the longest sober time inevitably, the one thing they have in common is that they are in a 12-step program. And that's just the way it is right now. So I believed what I was told, and I was desperate. So I threw myself into the 12 steps. I did what the third step of AA instructs. I made a decision to turn my life and my will over to the care of God, quote unquote, as I understood him. Sorry, I'm trying to jump back to my face. It was the stipulation, this as I understood him, that allowed me to access AA. I did not need to convert. I did not need to have a conception of a higher power that was a part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. All I needed to do was find that conception of a higher power that was, in the words of Polonius, true to myself. But this was a gulf of its own. While I'd been raised to be open-minded about spiritual things, I had no practical experience. And in Great Falls, Montana, surrounded by like the accoutrements of Christ, I felt a distinct loneliness. And then there were the miracle stories. This is a hard part to talk about because it's hard to communicate what it's like being in a rehab, surrounded by people who are very, very desperate, who are telling you one after the other, emphatically and with complete certainty, that they experienced an honest miracle, that they literally believed that their God literally came down and interceded on their behalf. I mean, I heard stories about people who claimed that God had spoken to them. They heard in the ear that they claimed that they'd been touched by him. Stories about healing. I mean, real honest to God miracle stories. And like after hearing those kinds of stories enough, I started to think to myself, like, do I need to convert? What's going on? What am I going to do? Because I couldn't, access my own spirituality. But on the last day of rehab, a counselor spoke to me, and he said something that stuck with me. He said, "It sounds like your parents raised you pretty well. You're searching for something spiritually, search there." And that's when I remembered the story my mother had told me when I was 6 years old. I believed in the magic of that story, and I still do. It might not be as grand and dramatic as Jesus healing a literal wound, but it is still a miracle story, for me at least. And in my case, it serves the role of miracle stories, which is to literalize the metaphors we use in the discussion of the spiritual. In my case, when I say the spiritual, what I'm talking about is the place that Joseph Campbell defines as the mystery that transcends all levels of human intellectual thought. I'm not here to talk about any one spirituality. I'm not here to talk about Christianity or Judaism. I'm here to talk about this. And my mother's miracle story is where I was able to access that mystery, that metaphor. So from my 30-day program in Montana, I was sent to a 90-day rehab in California. And it was in California that I finished AA's 12 steps for the first time. I cannot tell you exactly why the steps worked for me back then. Maybe it was just that I had a strong enough conception of a higher power and hadn't yet investigated my own spiritual life enough to feel the full implications of that conception. Maybe I was just desperate, or maybe it was that I quickly found a community in recovery. And a lot of evidence points to a lack of community and human connection as an essential root cause of addiction. The writer Johann Hari has some wonderful material about this, which I highly recommend everybody check out. Whatever the case, the steps helped back then, and after 2 years of sobriety, my life drastically changed. I came to UCI. I came to UCI with a basic spiritual conception rooted in non-dual philosophy. That came to me from my mother and from the Rupert Spira book that I was allowed in rehab. I'm not going to go into the particulars of like my spirituality. I don't think would be right, but it does bear a little bit for my own academic kind kind of work. And so I thought that this would be a nice summative way of talking about it. This is a quote from Burton Watson talking about his translation of the Lotus Sutra, which is the Mahayana Buddhist text. If all phenomena are characterized by the quality of emptiness, then emptiness must constitute the unchanging and abiding nature of existence. And therefore the absolute or unchanging world must be synonymous with the phenomenal one. Hence all mental and physical, totally lost my thing here. Distinctions, wow, I totally lost my stuff. Sorry guys, got a little messed up here of the screen sharing. I'm gonna get back to my screen. We perceive or conceive with our minds are part of a single underlying unity. So again, this is just kind of a basic formulation of non-dual philosophy. This conception, which I count as my own, came from my mother and Rupert Spira, and the Rupert Spira book I was allowed in rehab. At UCI, it flourished under the tutelage of Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, the Gnostic Gospels, the Upanishads, Rollo May, Flannery O'Connor, Mayer Gateskill, and even Oakley Hall. The writing and reading I've done in my time here has contributed to a spiritual vision of the world that, as an addict, is important to me. It's a similar kind of thing that I think Joseph Campbell means when he tells us to sit in a room and read and read and read and read the right books by the right people. Your mind is brought onto that level, and you have a nice, mild, slow-burning rapture all the time. Well, my first year, all my time at UCI, this is what I did. And in my first year, I was concerned with Carl Jung's concept of the shadow. I didn't understand this fully at the time, but the reason the shadow self interested me was that I had yet to make peace with a lot of just what had occurred in my past. If I was speaking to a room of addicts, I would have begun by rattling off a few war stories. Everyone loves a good war story in rehab. You get a little vicarious thrill, and it makes you feel a little less alone, knowing that you aren't the only one who's made mistakes. And it's here that you have one of the great problems in recovery. Forgiveness is a key pillar of AA's 12 steps. The big book says that resentment is poison to the alcoholic, and I think it's easy to see why, for addicts with histories they're ashamed of, forgiveness is necessary. But Carl Jung's solution for how to approach our dark sides and histories and the potential mistakes of our past is about synthesis. The gold is in the dark, and one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. In Jung's model, the addict's darknesses would be conversed with, understood, and transformed. The writing and study I was doing around this came to a head in a class on forms of forgiveness in medieval literature run by Professor Rebecca Davis. And it was a short story I wrote in that class, a short story concerning forgiveness, from which arose the spiritual and thematic thrust of this novel. I cannot tell you exactly where the premise for my novel came from. Like I said, this process of fiction writing is sometimes inexplicable, but it was toward the end of my first year at UCI that the idea began tossing around in my head. In short, this is the elevator pitch for my novel. A woman inherits a swath of land in the Mojave Desert on the condition that she provide a sky burial for her benefactor. I'm gonna jump back to me. What this has to do with forgiveness, condemnation, addiction, recovery, or even personal spirituality, at the time I had no idea. I just thought it was a compelling premise for a story, and if I'm being honest, I think that's a better reason than any. However, now that I have begun the actual writing process, I've begun to realize, after the fact, the reasons for some of the decisions I've made in the telling of this story. Why is a sky burial the central event of this book? For those of you who don't know what a sky burial is, it's an uncommon form of burial that was done in Native American cultures, Tibetan Buddhism cultures, and even Zoroastrian cultures. Basically, the idea is you put a corpse out on a platform and you let the birds eat them. The reason that this ritual is at the center of my novel is that it is a ritual. And there has been no bigger influence on my writing and my work at UCI than Joseph Campbell, for whom ritual is at the very center of storytelling. I am aware that there is a little resistance to Joseph Campbell on the university level. At least that's how it feels in my MFA program. But the truth is that there is no other writer or teacher who has spoken to me so deeply. In my second year at UCI, I became intensely focused on the craft study of structure. Joseph Campbell was a big part of this study, as was Aristotle, Shakespeare, a wonderful writer named John York, and UCI's own Julia Lupton, who led me on an independent study of Shakespeare's five-act structure. Under Julia Lupton's guidance, I created an outline of story structure based closely around Shakespeare's five acts and using Joseph Campbell's archetypal language. I'm going to take you very briefly through this structural conception, as it is a big part of what has shaped my own writing, and it involves the spiritual perspective that my novel is taking on forgiveness and recovery. I'm going to jump back here. So for Joseph Campbell, the mythic structure, which he outlines in The Hero with a Thousand Faces, is recreated through religious and spiritual ritual. It's a lot of words there. The rituals of human life, culture, primarily coming of age, marriage, and death, use an archetypal process to guide our personal roadmaps of change. As Bill Moyers summarizes in his interview with Joseph Campbell in The Power of Myth, myths are stories of our search through the ages of truth, for meaning, for significance. We all need to tell our story and to understand our story. We all need to understand death and to cope with death. And we all need help in our passages from birth to life and then to death. We need life to signify, to touch the eternal, to understand the mysterious, to find out who we are. My own conception of story structure keeps with this ultimate understanding of story as a guide for change and personal introspective understanding. But it's also important for me to make sure you all understand that struggle and that the conflict that occurs at the various stages of our lives, conflict, is fundamental to this vision of story structure. So whether you are talking about the three-act structure of a Hollywood film or the acts of a novel, the basic definition of what makes an act is a shift in the nature of a story's conflict. So this is the little poster board that I made while working with Julia Lupton. And it's a way for me to conceptualize not only story structure, but what I like to think of as a roadmap for change. I'm going to take you guys very briefly through it. I won't get super nerdy with the story structure stuff. But it is all based around Shakespeare's five-act structure and Joseph Campbell's archetypal vocabulary. So the first act begins with an archetypal home. Normalcy is established. Flaws are determined, desires are determined, and usually an internal struggle is determined. The protagonist then crosses the threshold, that's a term from Joseph Campbell, into Act 2. This is where we go from a normalcy into the true conflict of a story, the true conflict of a story. This is when Macbeth kills Duncan in Act 2, Scene 2 of the play. The third act's archetype is the elixir, or what the writer John York calls the truth of the story. The elixir is the discovery a protagonist makes that will help them overcome conflict. This is the moment Michael Corleone kills the cop and rival mobster, embracing the truth of who he is. In that case, with The Godfather, it would be a darkened version. He doesn't change for the good, but rather for the negative. Wolves are my fourth act's archetype. This is the crisis point. The idea is that in the deep dark of the woods, you come upon wolves. And at this moment is the crisis. Basically, this is the moment in the story where things get as bad as they can reasonably get. And finally, the fifth act is home again, changed. Part of the philosophy behind this vision of story is that fully accepting and embracing life means fully accepting and embracing struggle and sorrow. It is only through conflict and suffering that a story can progress and characters can grow. Joseph Campbell elevates this notion from a platitude about storytelling to the crowning point of my own spirituality. And apologies if I get a little choked up, I find this quote to be unbelievably beautiful. The field of time is the field of sorrow. All life is sorrowful, and it is. If you try to correct the sorrows, all you do is shift them somewhere else. Life is sorrowful. How do you live with that? You realize the eternal within yourself. You disengage and yet re-engage. You, and here's the beautiful formula, participate with joy in the sorrows of the world. You play the game. It hurts, but you know that you have found the place that is transcendent of injury and fulfillments. You are there, and that's it. I think this is what stories and spiritual experiences are meant to do. I think that this is what Edmund Burke is talking about when he talks about the sublime. I've heard a lot of talk about storytelling in my MFA program, that it's meant to make you think, or it's meant to make you learn something. And I don't believe that. I believe that what it's meant to do was written in the 1700s by Edmund Burke when he said that we were looking for an experience of that thing we call the sublime. And here's where I find it. So I was awarded the Center for Medical Humanities Fellowship over the summer of my MFA program's second year. The first 2 months of that summer, with the center's support, were the two most productive months of writing that I've yet had in this program. About 70 pages were the product of those 2 months. And if I were to estimate the current progress of my novel, I'd say I've just about finished my second act. I've established the flaws of my protagonist, and she's properly crossed the threshold into her conflict. And I've realized that my protagonist's own internal struggle is one of the essential struggles of addiction and recovery. She is, like many of us, searching for internal forgiveness for the mistakes of her past. But here is where my presentation again departs from the academic. Around this time in my life, I had a number of personal crises that shook what I thought were the stable foundations of my sobriety. And I'm not going to go into the nature of those crises, but the point is that I again turned to the 12 steps. There were some hard months. I was writing feverishly, preparing for my program's final year, and also doing the very often painful and intense work of the 12 steps. And it was at step 9, the step when we of AA are meant to make amends to those we've wronged in the past, that I felt my own spiritual structure suddenly be swept out from beneath my feet. What I'm talking about now is the ultimate issue that my novel concerns. And it is also what I see as a fundamental flaw, not only within AA, but with recovery as a whole. And also potentially within the spiritual values of our culture at large. This is, I believe, where my project most aligns with the goals of the Center for Medical Humanities. I'm going to jump again, sorry. So steps 5, 6, and 7 of the 12 steps read as follows. 5, we admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. 6, we were entirely ready to have God remove these defects of character. 7, we humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. These steps, as well as others, provide for the addict a model of forgiveness. It is a model of forgiveness we are all probably not only aware of, but that is so standard in the spiritual values of our culture that we never question it. Succinctly put, this model goes as follows. I confess that I am a sinner who can only be absolved by a higher power. In other words, sorry, I'm going to jump back here. In other words, the notion of forgiveness within AA's 12 steps is that you make an inventory of your moral wrongs. You confess that inventory to another person and to a higher power. And your higher power then absolves you. In other words, I am a sinner who needs to be absolved. I was unable to complete the steps for a second time. And the reason for this is that I have spent the last 3 years of my academic and artistic life growing toward a certain spiritual vision of the world. This is a spiritual vision that, rather than demonizing and repressing our personal darknesses as sin, instead, in the manner of Jung, sees our flaws as sources of energy that should be conversed with and brought to light. It is a spiritual vision that, in the manner of Joseph Campbell, is reconciling the mind to this brutal precondition of all life, which lives by the killing and eating of lives. And it is ultimately a life-affirming spiritual vision, rooted in the non-dual philosophy passed down to me from my mother. It's not a vision that conceives of God as an individual personality that will intercede to free me of some demonic idea of sin. Rather, it is a oneness in which everything, including our mistakes, is contained and therefore sublime. Maybe my spiritual schism is best delineated by how I decided to alter a prayer passed down to me by my sponsor. When faced with a dark thought or memory of the past, my sponsor told me to pray, "Lord, please take this darkness from me." I don't say that anymore. I now say, "Let me learn to love this." The ultimate question of my novel concerns how to achieve internal forgiveness, the internal forgiveness that is essential to recovery, despite existing outside of our culture's traditional Judeo-Christian model of sin and redemption. I don't have an easy answer to this question. If I did, I would not have needed to write a novel. But I believe that this question gets at the fundamental spiritual values of our society. I think that that's not something we pay much attention to. What are the spiritual values informing questions like forgiveness? I think these spiritually antiquated, and I would go so far as to say juvenile values about sin and redemption influence the smallest minutiae about how we treat people in our daily lives. I think that it may be a reason for our culture's easy comfort with both public and private condemnation. But that's all conjecture and extrapolation. For me, this project I'm working on is about a personal journey. There may be plenty of people who do not need a realized and vibrant personal spirituality in order to get on with the dreary business of living. But for me, I wasn't really able to start living until I thought back to my mother's cicada story and realized that at my core, there is a strong belief in this thing that Joseph Campbell only calls the mystery. So thank you all very much for listening. Thank you to the Center for Humanities for your support, and thank you to Kelly and Uka. I appreciate all of you guys for coming to listen. Thank you so much.
Zach, thank you so much, and dear to my heart, right? What the journey that you're going through, and thanks for sharing. And thanks for going to that space, right? I think that's a really hard space to go into, as you know, right? But just really grateful for your time. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, I'll ask a question if that's okay. You talked a little bit. I mean, like, what do you think after the book, right? I mean, I always ask everyone this, right? Especially related to this journey, right? Like, what's next?
Next, I'd like to publish a fantasy series that makes me a lot of money.
Okay, okay.
I'm a very shallow person, and I would like to have some money. But I don't know. I really don't know. I still don't feel that like I have a solid enough craft understanding. I felt like I
Yeah,
jumped into this novel just because it was a story that I really need to tell, and it could only be
right.
told in a novel. But when I get done with this, I think I'll probably go back to short stories and just kind of work on honing the craft more,
Okay.
rather than try to focus on some big stuff.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Does anybody else have any other questions or thoughts?
I have a
Hi,
question.
Vanessa. Welcome.
Hi. I want to thank Zach for the wonderful presentation and his vulnerability and
Yeah.
sharing. Yeah, I really appreciate it. His story. My question would be how you approach writing a character with shame, but also adding in the external conflicts and how you demonstrate through your writing, how their conflicts and how they approach those conflicts reflects their path to their own self-forgiveness.
Ooh, that's a good question. That's a big question. I mean, what you're talking about, I think, is like, I mean, so correct me if I'm wrong. I'll try to repeat the question back to you. It sounds like what you're asking is, how do you show, first, how do you show the shame? And then how
Mhm.
do you show moving through internal conflict um,
Mhm.
to
And,
resolve said
and
shame?
external, yeah, both.
So that's I think that's the key of it, right? It's how
Yeah.
the two play. I mentioned very briefly this writer named John York. He's actually not a writer. He's a BBC producer and executive, and he has this great book called Into the Woods, which is about 5X structure. And I really recommend it. And in my opinion, and I'm sure Michelle Latole and the people who run my program would want to draw and quarter me for saying this, but I think that like what you might call traditional story structure is the answer to that. Like moving through conflict, how you resolve the messy business that you throw into your characters' faces, that is how internal questions get answered. And like I think that there's a bit of metaphor that occurs as well. You have the external conflict, and that external conflict should somehow summon up that internal conflict. And with that internal conflict summoned, there's usually a moment where you have this thing that Joseph Campbell and John York would call the elixir, this moment in the middle of our story where there is an internal realization. A lot of the times that internal realization isn't like some big grand thing. Like James Joyce, he puts his elixir at the end of his stories. He puts the realization, he calls it the epiphany, and it just comes at the end. But in like more traditional mythic structure, it comes in the middle, and it's the thing that you use to defeat the ultimate struggle. Um, when it comes to writing shame, I don't know. It's really hard. I think Michelle Latole would say that the business of writing is the business of close observation, um, and I think that there is there's like Flannery O'Connor would talk about the dirt on the table, and there is dirt on the table when it comes to shame. And what I mean by that isn't like how we feel or big things. I mean, like they're little things, little ways that we hold ourselves, ways that we move our bodies, and then little thoughts. It's funny. I think we have, there's a thought that I have occasionally, which is that I suddenly will become very anxious that somebody can read my mind. And I will very, very quickly think to myself, think of a brick wall so that this person can't read my mind. And that's an absurd thing to think, and I know that's an absurd thing to think. But I think that that's like an anxious thought that lots of people like will suddenly compulsively have, and it's a pretty standard thing. I think there are probably people watching who can say, I've thought exactly that before. And with shame, I think there are similar kinds of thoughts and these like little things that work forward. Beyond that, I would just say you have to channel your own shame.
Thank you so much.
Wait, can I push you for a little bit, Zach? Like
Yeah.
from a neuroscience perspective, but don't you think that maybe people are kind of reading your mind? But from a sense of being like what you were just talking about,
Yeah.
right? Is like behavior and like all of these things and like facial expressions and past experiences and knowledge of these things, right? I mean, I'm just saying
There
that
is there's this wonderful quote by the comedian Pete Holmes.
yeah.
He says he's like talking or something. He says, "People say words shouldn't hurt you. That's insane. You know, tell someone they have a nice shirt and see what it does to their face. You know." And he says, "People say words are just things. That's bullshit. Words are not just things. Words are spells. We're casting spells on one another." I think that yeah, I do think they can read my mind a little bit. I think that's why I have that anxiety because
Right.
I'm thinking of something that I potentially am ashamed of, and I'm thinking, dear God, if they knew.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I think more so in that sense, in the sense of shame, right? But I think that when it's related to shame, thinking that's where the anxiety comes from, right? But yeah, anyway, there's lots of principles here that are being discussed, and it's really, thank you so much for your time. Does anybody else have any questions? Like you and I could chat for a long time. There's a lot of commonalities here. Any other thoughts from anybody else?
So I have another thing. I apologize.
Oh, Vanessa, never be sorry. Ask
Um,
away.
I'm also working on a novel, and my character deals with their own forgiveness and their own path of what they see as their own redemption. And I was wondering, I guess from Zach, if I could ever get some advice on it. Yeah,
Sure. Hold on 1 minute.
I can put my UCI email in the chat.
Instagram? Just kidding.
How about I drop my UCI email, and if you want, you can just shoot me an email. Just like remind me your name, and
Okay, for sure. Thank you so much.
yeah, of course. Happy to.
Yeah. Any other last thoughts from anyone? All right. Well, I appreciate everyone's time and thank you, Zach. Thanks for sharing, and I wish you the best of luck in your journey. And yeah, I think that I'm really excited to see where it takes you and more not so what the novel says, but what you learn about yourself and in that space, you know? I think that's a beautiful thing about writing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And you don't, and by the way, don't ever be sorry that you're not a traditional researcher. Okay?
Yeah, I just feel weird. I'm just like sitting here talking about myself for 30 minutes.
It's very ethnographic, right? So, yeah,
Mhm.
never be, that's something that I've learned in the arts, like being, in the arts is never, everyone has their own journey and always just own that journey, you know?
Thank you.
Oh, all right. Thank you and have a great day to everyone.
Actually, before they leave, so you're in neuroscience? They
Yeah, I'm
can.
going to turn off my thing. Hold on, stop.